727 days ago, on the 28th of October 2022, I made this prototype which eventually became my game, Soulstalker, and if you're watching this video, then the game is out right now on Switch, PlayStation, Xbox, and Steam, and there's also a launch discount, so all the links are in the description. But let me take you on the journey that resulted in the game's release. It spans a crazy lawsuit, a Kickstarter campaign, an early access release, and our first time self-publishing a game on consoles without any publisher. So the game is a bullet heaven roguelike with Paper Mario inspired graphics, and the whole reason that I wanted to make this is because I had recently played Brotato and Vampire Survivors, and I wondered if it would be possible for a game like this to have 3D graphics without being hit in performance so much. And as a developer, my number one platform has always been console, specifically the Nintendo Switch, and so my approach was specifically targeting that console, and I was wondering if it would be possible to get a 3D bullet heaven on the platform. So on October 28th, I made this little test with about as many enemies as I thought would be on screen at maximum, and in the end, the test was a success. And so after that, I got right into making the game design document and outlining what the core identity of the game would be. So of course, all of my games have 2D characters and 3D worlds, and especially for this game, that's super important because I wanted to see if that was possible to do on the Nintendo Switch. So that's a key part of the game's identity. But then on top of that, I also made 3 key design pillars that I had to follow throughout the whole development to make sure that the game ended up how I wanted to. And so this slide here is right out of the original game design document, and you can see the first design pillar was that the game had to include auto attacking. And so in Brotato and Vampire Survivors, I felt that auto attacking was such a big part of why they felt so different to other roguelikes, and I really wanted my game to make players feel the same way. Then the second design pillar was that the game's difficulty entirely had to come from the decisions that the players made. I think if you're going to make a game like this one, for example, that doesn't really have much mechanical difficulty because of the auto attacking, you have to include difficulty somewhere else so players have something to think about. And I thought making everything super decision focused was the perfect way of doing that. And then finally, because the game was a bullet heaven roguelike specifically, I felt that it really needed a good price to playtime ratio. This is the case for games like Brotato and Vampire Survivors, and so I had to find a way to compete, right? And I actually think that here I have one disadvantage that the other two don't have, but this one disadvantage I think also plays in my favor. At the time that I was planning this game, no games in this style had ever been on console, and I think there's a good reason for that. The genre is based mostly on being cheap to make, and that's why developers are able to price the game so cheaply. So if you check the genre page on Steam, the average is maybe like $5 to $7.5, and then it really goes up to $10, but that's like the hard cap. So if you don't really have a smash hit, it's really hard to pay for porting because you really need a lot of copies sold to make console porting worthwhile. Fortunately, not only did we partner up with Tim from Origami Panda Studio for the ports, who is an absolutely fantastic programmer, but everything internally was done between Tim and I, so we didn't really just drop off the game like a lot of indies do. We were super involved in the porting process throughout the whole thing, and especially for myself, who is intimately aware of how all the systems work, because I'm the one that made them, I think that was a huge help, because then Tim could get up to speed way faster than a porting studio that doesn't really have that involvement would be able to usually. Another thing is that the game was really designed with Switch in mind, so for example, Vampire Survivors has these really expansive levels, and it works super well for them because the game is in 2D, so the performance impact is not as much as for us, for example, because our game is 3D. So instead of having super big levels like that game does, I actually ended up taking Brotato's approach, which actually is my favorite game in the genre anyways, and that is that the game has small areas, and you have discrete rounds in these areas, so in the end, this was a huge lifesaver, and in the future, we're going to be porting one of my games in the same genre that didn't have this going for it. So if you want to see how that was super difficult to deal with and how Soulstalker was much easier to develop in comparison, then subscribe to keep an eye for that. So the first thing that I added in this month in the game's core development was actually the game's map system, and so it looks super close to Slay Spire's map system, but actually later on it changed quite a bit, and you'll see why, because I'll go over that. But apart from that, we also added the shop system and also made it such that enemies drop XP so you can get levels and actually use that to buy stuff in the shop. But actually this ended up changing as well later on. So quite a few things that were laid in place but also ended up not being the final thing. The final thing that happened in this month is that we added another person to the team, and that was Tim the composer. So we had previously been already working with Tim the artist, then Tim the porter is obviously involved with the porting, and so we have a third Tim now, Tim the musician. He's a fantastic composer. So it's kind of crazy that everybody in the core part of the team is called Tim, except for me, so maybe I should just change my name, you know? So the third month of the game's development marked a super important step, and that is because we actually started adding content. And so the first thing that this was manifested in was we added Vixen, a new character that was of course made by Tim the artist. But because this character was all about projectile weapons, we also had to add the projectile weapons, so a lot of weapons were added this month as well. So we added two final things in this month, the first of which was we added the final boss for the first act, so you can actually go through the whole run now, even though it's a bit short. And then the second thing is that the leveling system that I mentioned previously, we completely removed that and made it such that enemies just drop coins. So using levels to buy things before didn't really work super well because you had to really level up super frequently to make it just that you can get enough currency to re-roll and make things happen in a way that made sense for the game's design. So we just completely axed that because otherwise if you're just leveling up all the time, why are the levels even there? And so the game now has currency instead. The fourth month was another one that was mostly spent on refactoring stuff because until this point you can upgrade both your weapons and your trinkets. So whenever you bought a weapon or a trinket and you got a duplicate, they got increased stats. But we actually completely removed the ability to upgrade trinkets in this month. The reason that I did this was because I felt like I was spending a lot of time balancing the level ups of each trinket, and I felt that it was just way better time spent to just make more trinkets that have a more wide variety of use cases instead of having fewer ones that you just upgrade. Then I also of course added a new character called Quijano, which is kind of like a tank that attacks really quickly and can't upgrade its stats beyond attack speed and max HP. So this character is very different from others because you can't focus on upgrading things that you usually would, like for example power. You really have to either focus on dexterity, which is attack speed, and your max HP, or go for those weird synergies that are not related to your main stats. So this month we added tons of music made by Tim, but as well the art team was super busy because he made one of my favorite characters even to this day, and its name is Tempest. And so its ability is that any projectile weapon that it shoots, whenever it hits an enemy, it has a chance of exploding. And so it sounds very simple, right? It just seems almost like you're increasing damage through the explosions, but there are tons of synergies that you can actually put into place if you have the right trinkets. Like for example, if you have a critical hit build with a shuriken that attacks super frequently, then you can actually increase your explosion damage if you have the right trinket. Or another example is if you have a projectile that causes bleed, and then all the enemies are getting damaged over time because of the bleed. If you have this trinket here that causes enemies that bleed to explode, then you have way more explosions and you're just exploding everything at once with both your bleed explosions and your ice explosions. But these are just two examples to show you that the game has really evolved at this point and the synergies are really starting to show up. So you could argue that this month was one of the most important ones for the entire development of Soulstalker, and that is because we actually launched a Kickstarter campaign. So apart from that, we also did localization to French and Spanish, but the game ended up being funded at 317%, which I'm so thankful for. And that is part of the reason for why the game ended up being able to go to so many platforms and ended up being so visually polished. So running off of the success of the Kickstarter, the first thing that we did this month was change how the weapons would be upgraded. So as I explained, previously you would have to buy duplicates like the trinkets to upgrade your weapons and then the stats would be upgraded. But we completely changed that, and so what you do now is that in the campfires where previously you would heal, you can upgrade your weapons in specific stats. So if you want to upgrade the cooldown or upgrade the damage or the range, you can do that, and so everything is way more strategic. And then later on, this was such a success that we actually ended up implementing this upgrade system to the shops as well. So whenever you were deciding to buy weapons, you can also decide to upgrade them. This also laid the groundwork for one of the coolest systems in the game that we added later on, which was weapon evolution. The 8th month was all about content. We added so many characters, trinkets, weapons, areas, ascension levels that by the end of it, the game was 27% bigger than it was in the previous month. At this point, Soulstalker was gearing up for the early access launch, and it was actually a super important month because we participated in the Steam Next Fest. So we had a demo prepared and everything, but we were super confident because we had been testing everything with the Kickstarter backers up to this point, and so it actually paid off because we got a pretty nice amount of wish lists. On top of that, we also got tons of feedback, and so we applied tons of that into the game before the launch, and that helped a ton. Month 10 was super simple, and that's because the game launched in month 11. So all this month was spent on fixing bugs, tying up loose ends, and just doing all that sort of boring development stuff that you probably don't want to see in a devlog. And so here we are at the halfway point of Soulstalker's development and when it launched into Steam Early Access. So at its launch, it had 7,500 wishlists, which I was pretty happy with. It was basically what I expected. The game's scope was a bit smaller than my previous one, so that's what I was hoping for. And actually the game's sales reflected what I thought would happen based on the wishlist, so it's nice to see that there's a correlation there still. This was always going to be a console first game, and so everything leading up from before Early Access to Steam Early Access and beyond Steam Early Access was going to be leading up to the console versions of the game, particularly Switch, Xbox, and PlayStation. And so that was still what we were banking on. Because we launched the game in this month, it didn't really see that many additions. We were just talking to the community, seeing what they felt, seeing how they wanted the game to evolve throughout early access. But actually something came up, and I was a bit worried because I knew this would come up, but I was hoping it wouldn't, and that was that the game didn't really have a progression system. The way you would progress was just by unlocking more difficulties, and then it was a bit like Slay the Spire where you got better as you unlocked more difficulties. But people wanted something a bit more progression-y than that. And so I really had to think hard and hard because I didn't want to make the game less decision-based by allowing players to rely on stat upgrades to get themselves through the ascension levels. And so I thought hard, and I actually ended up coming up with a progression system that both fulfilled my desire to make the game super decision-focused and hopefully would also work for the players that wanted a progression system. It was a quite substantial undertaking though, so it would take a few months of development to get this actually in-game, but you'll see very soon. So throughout month 12, I worked quite a bit on the progression system that I just mentioned, but actually the game was radically changed in one part, and that is the map system. So as I explained previously, there was like this little pathing that was kind of like Slay the Spire, but a lot of players complained that the pathing wasn't really strategic because there weren't enough node options, right? Makes sense. The game is a very different game than Slay the Spire, and so that game has a lot of options for the nodes. We don't have quite as many because we want to focus more on combat, and so I was thinking, how do we keep kind of a map system still without having it feel like it's kind of pointless? And so I ended up doing something that's kind of like a mix between what Hades does and what Slay the Spire does, and so the map system was completely overhauled to make it like this. So it's a bit simpler, but there's still like the choice, right? And so it's very similar to Hades in that whenever you beat a room in that game, you get two choices, and we have the same thing kind of, except ours is represented in a map. And throughout the next months of development, we also ended up adding a lot more nodes as well. And so we kind of made the game a bit simpler in terms of pathing, but we added a bit more choice over time. So for this month, as always, we added more content, more characters, more of all that sort of stuff. But this is the month that the progression system finally made its way to the game. And so I finally got to explain to you what that's like. And so previously, as I said, whenever you beat a run, nothing would happen. You would just increase the ascension level if you beat the game at your highest ascension level. But now, whether you win or lose, you actually get a new currency called souls, right? And so what do souls do? Well, you don't use them to increase stats, but you use them to actually buy starting weapons and starting trinkets in the main menu. So previously, all the characters had a set list of starting weapons and starting trinkets, so it was kind of built for that character. But now any trinket and any weapon can be bought by any character, and you can use it at the start of every run. So obviously you progress and it makes your character stronger, but actually because the trinkets and the weapons are so specific to your builds, you only become stronger if you actually know enough about the game to know how to exploit this. So it kind of fixes the issues for the players that wanted something to work towards, which is unlock everything, but it also fixes my issue because players that don't know the game can't take advantage of this, and so it still encourages decision making for the players to get better. So that was a huge addition that we made in month 13, but we actually also did a bunch of performance improvements, spawning changes, and just general stability fixes as well. Month 14 was a huge month for the game, and I think you're starting to see a pattern here. But what we started doing is bring Tim on board to start porting the game to Switch, PlayStation, and Xbox. So we did tons of optimizations, and you're starting implementing all the relevant things into the game so we can start porting whenever the game is finished. And so because tons of the porting process on Nintendo Switch involves optimization, we did tons of that this month, and actually I made an entire video about the 5 key things that we did to optimize the game for Switch. And so at the end of the video, I'll show you where you can find that, and if I had known these things before we started all of this, I think the porting process would have been much faster. There is one update that I think made the biggest impact on Soulstalker throughout the early access process, and it's the one that happened in this month, month 15. The meta progression made a huge difference, the map rework made a huge difference, but this is the one that I think actually really gave Soulstalker its whole new identity. And that is, I made an entire hub world for the game. And so the reason that I added the hub is because not only do I think it plays to my strengths, but no other game in the genre has a hub like this, so it really makes Soulstalker stand out. And so at first, this is how it started looking. I did some NPC tests, and by the end of it, there's tons of NPCs everywhere. And this was absolutely the update that the early access players responded the strongest to, which I'm super happy about because it's probably the one that I put the most work into. After overhauling so many of the game's core systems over the past months, like the map system, the overworld, and the meta progression, I really felt that the game needed to be unchanged for a bit so that players could give me good feedback. That was a result of them really wrestling with the game for a good while, so I mostly focused on this month on fixing bugs and just general stability things. Month 17 saw a return to form in terms of adding game-changing elements to the game, but actually it's a bit less intrusive this time around, and that was the addition of pets. So if you explored around the overworld and you found this turnip after doing some side quests, then you could unlock pets and you can use your souls to buy the pets. And so they follow you around in the overworld and actually in combat as well. And different pets either have a weapon or they have statistical improvements to your character that you can choose based on what works better for your build. This month saw the final big addition to the game before we went full on importing, and that was the addition of Act 3. So until this point, the game had 2 acts, which combined were probably 20 minutes on average, but I think I wanted the game to be 25 minutes per run on average. So Act 3 was actually a bit shorter than the other ones, but it was a bit more difficult. So that in combination with the final boss, I think really made the game feel like it was actually properly done, and what was left was just improving things that were already there. Month 19 was when development really started to change. We really just spent all this time on porting, but we did find some time to add some things to the overworld, like, for example, we added this retro filter or this day-night system. So nothing major, we really just focused on porting, and you can really feel that it was the beginning of the end of development. Months 20, 21, 22, and 23, again, were spent entirely on porting, so there's not much I can explain, but we really spent our time implementing the SDKs, doing more performance fixes, doing whatever we had to do in the certification process for all the platforms, and it was a super interesting learning experience, especially to go through all of this with Tim. So in the end, Soulstalker took 24 months to develop, or 727 days, which is definitely a bit longer than I had hoped for, but I'm super happy with the end product, so I can't really complain. It was also a game that really kept me afloat during the toughest part of my game development career, and that was because the game that I released right before this was sued right as Soulstalker's development actually started. Fortunately though, as of 6 days since this video came out, everything has been resolved and I announced it to everybody, and I'm so happy to finally have The Outbound Ghost, which was that original game, back in my hands, and for Soulstalker to be released as my first self-published console game. So this is really like the start of a new era, and I'm so excited to bring you new games super soon. We have so much in the pipeline that is kind of crazy. But if you want to support me, then you can check out Soulstalker on Steam, Switch, PlayStation, Xbox. The links are in the description, and I'll see you next time for the first Outbound Ghost devlog after the lawsuit's over. Bye.